The young and the restless spoiler's nightfall no longer meant rest for Mariah, it meant the descent into torment. Every time the sun sank beneath the horizon and silence crept through the walls of her hotel suite in Nice, a different kind of darkness clawed its way into her mind, memories, perhaps hallucinations, but more vividly than dreams and too coherent to be denied. She could feel the pressure of her hands around someone's neck, the resistance of flesh and bone beneath her grasp, the terror in a man's eyes that flickered before fading into a lifeless glaze. But who was he? Why did she do it? And more importantly, why couldn't she stop seeing it, reliving it, feeling it again and again in ever crueler detail? The chaos of those recollections twisted themselves into knots with each passing night. Alone in her room, the sound of dripping water or the creak of floorboards would send her into panic. The edge of the mirror reminded her of broken glass, the scent of cheap cologne in a hallway transported her to the final seconds before the act. She didn't remember every moment, but what she did remember was paralyzing. There had been a man, older, with a gravelly voice and a heavy hand. His presence had frightened her. His words had cornered her. His actions, what did he do to make her snap? It hadn't been planned. There had been whine, confusion, fear, a raised hand, a defensive push, no, more than that, a fatal reaction. Something animalistic had taken over. She remembered the pressure she applied, the scream that never came, and the silence that followed. But she couldn't remember his name. As her days wore on in Nice, she found herself spiraling. Tessa tried to comfort her, but Mariah had become emotionally unrecognizable. There was a haunting vacancy behind her eyes. She insisted she was just stressed from work, from the travel, from being away from their child, but when she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a monster wearing her skin. She began lashing out without provocation, pushing people away, and flinching at shadows. But despite the fog in her mind, she was keenly aware of one thing: a body would be discovered soon. And when it was, her entire world would be engulfed in flames. And then it happened. A decomposing male corpse was discovered at the edge of a wooded trail near a secluded vineyard outside Nice. The story broke in local papers first, then made its way into international headlines when authorities confirmed that the man had not died by accident. His death had been brutal, manual strangulation. There were signs of a struggle. Defensive wounds. A clump of red hair clutched in his lifeless fingers. Mariah stared at the news in horror, as if staring into the mouth of the beast that had come to claim her. Panic gripped her throat. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe she hadn't really done it. Maybe she had dreamed it all. But deep inside, she knew. It was him. She had killed him. And now he was part of the world again, no longer buried in her mind, but exposed, rotting, accusing, demanding justice. And yet, as the investigation intensified and pressure mounted, Mariah did not come forward. Her survival instinct was stronger than her guilt. Instead of surrendering to the truth, she began scanning for a scapegoat. Her paranoia needed an outlet. Her internal guilt turned outward, searching for someone, anyone, who could be blamed. And then the idea came to her like a cruel epiphany. Claire. Claire had been in the region. Claire was blonde. Claire had baggage. Claire was unstable. Claire had reasons to snap. That was the narrative Mariah began constructing, not publicly, but mentally, quietly. She wasn't proud of it, but she couldn't silence the voice inside that whispered, "They'll never suspect you if she goes down first." The authorities had already started drawing dangerous connections. Surveillance footage near the scene had captured a woman with long blonde hair running from the direction of the vineyard in the middle of the night. Her face was obscured, but her posture was strikingly similar to Claire's. Someone had even remembered seeing Claire in the company of a man who matched the victim's description days before the murder. The pieces began falling into place, but not in the way they should have. Victoria was the first to be informed that her daughter was under suspicion. Her reaction was volcanic. She stormed into the police station, livid that the girl she had fought to protect and rebuild would now be publicly humiliated and torn apart by this kind of baseless accusation. Claire, too stunned to even defend herself at first, sat in disbelief. She didn't even know the man. She hadn't been near the vineyard. But the evidence, flimsy as it was, had been compiled in a way that gave it weight. She had no alibi for the specific hour. Her phone had been turned off. And worst of all, the media had caught wind of it. Mariah watched it unfold from a distance, struggling with a grotesque mix of guilt and relief. The more the world pointed fingers at Claire, the more shielded she felt. But it came at a cost. Her mental health continued to deteriorate. The nightmares grew worse, and Tessa became increasingly worried. Mariah stopped sleeping. She paced the suite at night, whispering to herself, sometimes crying out in the dark. She insisted they stay in Nice longer despite Tessa's pleas to return home. Meanwhile, Claire was officially brought in for questioning. Victoria accompanied her, raging against the insinuations, but the investigators were relentless. The evidence was circumstantial, but there was enough of it to demand answers. Claire's fingerprints weren't on the body, but the scarf used to dispose of it had traces of blonde hair consistent with hers. It didn't matter that the scarf was a common brand, or that hair transfer could have happened in a dozen other ways. The pressure to close the case was growing. The media frenzy demanded resolution. Mariah began to feel the walls closing in. Her internal war raged silently while the world turned its attention to someone else. She wanted to confess, to scream it from the rooftops and take back control of her life, but fear strangled her more effectively than she had strangled him. She imagined the look in Tessa's eyes, the sound of their child crying as she was taken away in handcuffs. She couldn't do it. She wasn't ready to be destroyed. Not yet. But what Mariah didn't realize was that her erratic behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. Tessa had begun documenting her downward spiral, even going as far as recording one of her sleep-induced rants where she murmured fragments like "he deserved it, he touched me, and I couldn't breathe until he stopped breathing." Tessa didn't understand what it meant at first, but when the body was discovered and the police released the manner of death, everything changed. Tessa had suspicions, vague and horrifying, and they were growing stronger by the day. Meanwhile, back in Genoa City, Sharon received a cryptic message from someone in the French press claiming there may be a connection between the dead man in Nice and Mariah Copeland. At first, she dismissed it as another twisted attempt to drag their family into a scandal. But the more she investigated, the more the pieces began to align in a terrifying pattern. Sharon knew her daughter had a troubled past, but she never imagined this. She booked the next flight to France. By the time Sharon arrived, Claire had been released but remained under surveillance. The investigators had no clear motive, no confession, and were growing increasingly frustrated. Mariah, meanwhile, was unraveling. One night, she stood barefoot in the middle of a rain-soaked courtyard, staring at the sky, whispering apologies to no one. She was at her breaking point. And Tessa, now afraid for both Mariah and their child, had to make an impossible decision. Sharon confronted her daughter in the suite, begging her to tell the truth. But the moment Mariah met her mother's gaze, something inside her cracked. She fell to the ground, sobbing, unable to speak. Tessa stood by the door with their child in her arms, her eyes filled with silent tears. She had sent the audio to the authorities hours earlier. And so, the truth began to emerge, but not through confession. Through evidence. Through heartbreak. Through the unraveling of a woman who had been consumed by fear and shame. The murder investigation in Nice was far from over, but the narrative had shifted once more. Claire was no longer the focus. The spotlight had turned toward Mariah. And this time, there would be no escaping the shadows of what she had done. The silence in Mariah's hotel room had become unbearable, a void thick with tension and guilt that clung to the air like humidity before a storm. Every creak in the wooden floorboards beneath her feet sounded like an echo of judgment, and each flicker of the hallway lights cast shadows that twisted into the distorted shape of a man she couldn't forget. The image of his face. Pale, unblinking, contorted in that last instant of disbelief and horror, never truly left her, even in sleep. Especially in sleep. In her dreams, his hands reached for her neck, his voice slurred with menace and entitlement, and she felt again the trembling in her own fingers as they closed around his throat. It hadn't been cold-blooded murder. It hadn't been premeditated. But it had been lethal. And now that secret, which she had hoped would remain buried in the depths of her subconscious forever, was clawing its way back into the light with a vengeance she could no longer ignore. At first, she told herself that she was protecting herself, her family, and her sanity by pretending it hadn't happened. But the news reports shattered that fragile illusion. A body had been discovered in the hills near Nice, France, badly decomposed but unmistakably a victim of homicide. The method was unmistakable: strangulation by hand, with evidence of a struggle. Defensive wounds. Hair fragments in his fingernails. DNA was being processed, but the French authorities were already circling. And fate, in all its cruel precision, decided to pin the crime on Claire. A grainy surveillance image, a vague witness description, and the unfortunate reality of Claire being in the same region at the same time placed her squarely in the crosshairs. Mariah watched as the media hounded Claire, as Victoria raged against the accusations, as the world debated whether a young woman trying to rebuild her life could have committed such a heinous act. And instead of stepping forward, Mariah clung to the shadows, paralyzed by fear, guilt, and the unraveling of her own sanity. But guilt is never content to remain hidden. It seeps through the cracks, contaminating everything it touches. Mariah's relationship with Tessa, once a source of joy and stability, began to fracture under the weight of secrets. She withdrew emotionally, flinched at the touch of her wife, and avoided any mention of their child, afraid that the darkness within her might somehow taint the innocent. Tessa noticed everything: the sleepless nights, the muttered confessions in the dark, the tremor in Mariah's hands whenever someone mentioned the body found outside the vineyard. And though Tessa asked, begged, and pleaded for the truth, Mariah remained silent, retreating into a world only she could see. A world haunted by blood and silence. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Genoa City, Kane Ashby was sitting at his desk, staring at an envelope that had arrived with no return address. Inside was a photo, faded, wrinkled, but unmistakable. It was a picture of his estranged father, Malcolm Ashby, standing near a vineyard in the south of France. The caption on the back was scribbled in red ink: "He never made it back." Beneath the photo was a set of GPS coordinates. Kane's heart raced, and his hands trembled. He hadn't seen Malcolm in over 20 years. Their last conversation had been filled with bitterness and accusations, but now there was a gnawing sense that something was deeply wrong. Against his better judgment, Kane boarded a flight to Nice, determined to track down the man who had abandoned him, hoping for reconciliation. Or at least closure. What he found instead was a nightmare. The vineyard at the coordinates was cordoned off by police tape. Local authorities confirmed that a body had been discovered nearby, and when Kane insisted on identifying the remains, he was met with resistance until DNA results arrived. Malcolm Ashby was dead. Murdered. Strangled. Left to rot beneath the unforgiving Mediterranean sun. Kane stood at the morgue, staring down at the corpse of a man he had hated for most of his life but never stopped yearning to understand. But as the shock gave way to grief, something darker took root in him: the need for justice. Or perhaps, vengeance. The detectives offered little hope. They had no clear suspect, just a set of vague leads, a partial fingerprint, and strands of blonde hair. Kane asked about witnesses, footage, anything that might help him piece together the final days of his father's life. He discovered that Malcolm had been staying in a boutique hotel not far from the beach, coincidentally, the same hotel where Mariah and Tessa had booked their extended stay. He found Malcolm's room ransacked, his journal missing, but one chilling clue left behind, a single red hair woven into the fabric of the bedsheets. Kane's instincts sharpened. He began reviewing security footage from the hotel, searching for any interaction between his father and other guests. That's when he saw her, Mariah, exiting the elevator late at night, looking disoriented, her hair wet, a bruise forming on her arm. He found another clip from 2 days prior, showing Malcolm brushing past her in the hallway. Something about their interaction was off, too tense, too abrupt. Kane requested additional footage, hired a local tech expert to enhance the video, and the more he watched, the more he became convinced Mariah knew something. Perhaps everything. Back in the hotel, Mariah felt the noose tightening. She sensed eyes watching her, felt footsteps behind her in empty corridors, and began to fear that the truth had somehow taken form and was stalking her. Tessa couldn't reach her anymore. She begged Mariah to leave Nice, to come home, to face whatever was haunting her. But Mariah refused. Her nightmares had become her reality, and she was convinced that if she left, she would never escape the consequences. She barely ate, barely spoke, and spent hours staring out the window at the hills where the body had been found. Then came the letter. Slipped under her door in the middle of the night. No return address, no signature. Just one line, "You killed the wrong man." The next morning, Tessa found Mariah curled up on the bathroom floor, her knuckles scraped, the mirror shattered. She had hit it with her fist. She kept muttering his name. Malcolm. How could she have known his name? Tessa took the broken pieces of the note, now crumpled and torn, and locked them in her suitcase, terrified of what they meant. But Kane wasn't finished. He followed the trail, tracing Mariah's steps through Nice, uncovering receipts, timestamps, witness statements. He learned that she had been seen drinking alone the night of the murder, that she had disappeared for several hours, and that a hotel staff member remembered hearing screaming from a private hallway. He returned to the morgue to confirm Malcolm's belongings. His wallet was gone. His journal was gone. But a single page had been found near the body, smeared with blood. A page that read, "The girl from Genoa City. Red hair. She knows." Now there was no doubt. Kane confronted Tessa first, calmly, almost gently. But Tessa, torn between loyalty and fear, said nothing. So Kane turned to Claire. He told her everything, how she had been blamed, how the evidence had pointed to her, and how the real killer was someone close to both of them. Claire was stunned, furious, and deeply shaken. And in her own way, she too began to crumble. The thought that she had nearly gone to prison for someone else's crime ignited something volatile in her. She agreed to help Kane, but not out of revenge. Out of a desperate need to clear her name. Together, they devised a plan. Claire would reach out to Mariah, invite her to a secluded cafe in the old quarter of Nice. Kane would wait nearby, watching, listening. They wouldn't accuse her directly, not yet. But they would watch her, observe her, and see what the pressure did to her mind. Mariah showed up, late, nervous, shaking. Claire kept the conversation casual at first, but slowly guided it toward the vineyard, the murder, the media frenzy. Mariah's hands trembled. Her eyes darted to every shadow. She whispered something about protection. About how the world had no idea what he tried to do to her. Claire leaned in closer, asked her who. And Mariah froze. It was in that instant Kane knew. She was guilty. Not because she said it, but because her entire body screamed it. The cafe fell into silence. Claire excused herself. Mariah sat alone, head bowed. Kane didn't approach her. Not yet. He walked away into the twilight, his jaw clenched, his heart pounding with rage and sorrow. Mariah had killed his father. But she had also become a prisoner of that moment, perhaps even a victim in her own right. Still, Kane couldn't forgive. Not yet. Not after everything he'd uncovered. He contacted the authorities and handed over all the evidence. Tessa's recordings. The footage. The notes. Everything. And then he booked a flight home, knowing that the next chapter in this nightmare had just begun. Because in Genoa City, the fallout would be nuclear. The truth about Malcolm Ashby's death would shake the foundations of trust among families and friends. Devon would feel betrayed. Sharon would be devastated. Tessa would be torn between love and justice. And Mariah, once celebrated for her resilience and redemption, would become a symbol of how trauma, when left to fester, can explode into something unrecognizable. And Kane, standing in the ashes of his broken legacy, would ask himself the question that might never have an answer: was it justice, or was it revenge?